so it's nice to see all of us, come together. I think what we got to see you in like 2 days or something like that, maybe even. But without further ado, you don't need to hear from me. Dr. Yaron Siegman, a good friend, an amazing acupuncturist, Chinese herbal medicine, Qigong, Tai Chi, and so many other things. But I'll let him speak about himself. So I hope everybody really thank you all for coming to be a part of this, and thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Ira, Val, Zenden, and Boca Raton for everyone watching the recording, and everyone for coming. The topic that I called it, the title that I called the class is Medicine Without God. We'll get into it towards the end of the class. What I mean, actually, the bulk of what I want to talk about is what happened to medicine in the 20th century in China, how they used it for political gain, and of course, it's very relevant when I will talk about the plague that they had in China 100 years ago, and then in COVID now, and what happened here in COVID. So I want to maybe just give it a little bit personal touch and telling you how I came to this, what's my story. And, I started with holistic medicine about 34 years ago in Israel. At that time, there was no Chinese medicine in Israel or acupuncture, but there were others, some holistic, reflexology, and whatever. So I started there. And then I left Israel after the army. I went to New Zealand and I found an acupuncture school that there was only one program in New Zealand at the time, and they were already halfway in the middle. And when you study traditional Chinese medicine, the first year and a half is all Western medicine, anatomy, physiology, and then the second half of the course of the 3 years is Chinese medicine theory. So I got there in the middle just when they finished all the Western medicine. And the owner of the school said, look, we already did a year and a half of Western medicine, so you can start with us the Chinese medicine part, but you have to catch up by yourself, the whole thing. So that's what I did, and I finished that course studying all the Western medicine by myself, all the Chinese medicine in the class. And which is actually quite important, the story, half Western medicine, half Chinese, it will tie into the lecture. After that, so when I was in New Zealand, I went to Chinatown there, and it was a Tai Chi teacher. And he could speak only 2 words in English. And so he was teaching me Tai Chi. And every time when I would practice what he would teach me, he would say, remember, you remember, you remember. So that's all I learned from him about a year. But at the end, I told him, look, I finished the acupuncture course and I want to go to China. He said, oh, all of a sudden, he knew a few more words. He said, oh, China, I can organize for you China. So I paid him whatever, a few $100s, and he arranged me. I didn't know at the time, but when I got to Beijing to stay with his family, with his wife and daughter, only later I realized what actually was the situation. Well, that's the first time in China. I didn't know what's going on there. So I stayed with them. It was like a very simple 1-bedroom apartment. I slept on the couch, the mother and the daughter in the room. Her brother came to make sure there's a man in the house or whatever. They couldn't speak English. I couldn't speak Chinese. Every day they put me like a bowl of snails. And I'm like, I don't want to eat that, but I don't know how to speak to them. So I'm trying with a little dictionary, find words. What? We don't understand. Like this 2-3 months. Just later on, I realized, and now and again, a letter came from the father. And the mother would like look in the letter and open it. I guess he was supposed to send the money that I paid him, but he never sent her. And she was trying to tell me something, but I don't know what the hell she was saying. So in any case, it was very interesting first encounter with China. And there were a lot of stories, like the laundry machine actually didn't work. So you put water with the laundry with a broomstick. You're like, there's no shower, only thing. In any case, for a Westerner, first time coming there, that was a total shock. But it was great. Later on, I realized that the husband, he was in the Peking Opera, which is very famous. He traveled around the world, and then he defected China. And when people in China at the time, in a communist country, go away, the family is like responsible for it. So the mom lost her job and he was kind of sending me there to give her money, but he would never send the money, all kind of stories like that. But that was that kind of sad story. So I studied Chinese medicine in New Zealand and then in China, in Beijing, and a few other places, what they call traditional Chinese medicine.
Wait, so he never sent her the money?
I gave him the money. I didn't know what she wanted, and they kind of threw me around here and there. It's a long story, but that's not the topic of this. I just wanted to share, I just want to share my first experience with communist China.
Right.
Why did we talk? And at that time, there were hardly any cars in China. Everybody is on bicycle with the blue uniform, with the Mao hat. It was kind of eerie, like you see big city with big roads and bridges and everybody on bicycle, like in few trucks and buses. So I realized that I have to study Chinese. Up to this point, I learned Chinese medicine in English, translation and this. I realized it can't be that I can't talk to them, I don't understand anything. And I can do Chinese medicine, you know, so that's how it kind of came to me first, that I had to study, to read and write and speak Chinese. So I did that, I moved to Germany a few years, on university I studied Chinese, I went back and forth to China, this time in Chinese, and I realized that Chinese medicine also had ancient texts, many ancient texts that I started to investigate. And with the years, I realized that what I learned in these texts oftentimes was not the same what I learned in New Zealand in the earlier. I say that doesn't make sense because I learned traditional Chinese. What is that all? Right, all of a sudden I realized, and then some people are calling it classical Chinese medicine. So there is traditional Chinese medicine, which apparently is not classical, and there is classical like ancient text, which is supposed to be ancient. So this is like how I started going into this whole story, and that's how I want to start the conversation here. So every time when I do like this, you just do the
All right.
arrow sign.
Is that my first one?
Yes.
All right.
Okay. So this book, the Shang Shu, in chapter Officer of the Zhou, actually the name in English. Oh no! It's okay. I'll try to restart it.
Sorry, guys.
Here, we'll just find another spot for you, and I'll take care of that.
Just to switch on the.
No,
that's fine, right there.
Continue back. Okay, so just forget everything that I said. Bring the energy back. So it's like, you know what, every time when I kind of go on a rant, you just turn off the electricity. Dark, no, it's a- Yeah, I just want to make, this is one of the most earliest texts that we still have today. And in English, when you translated this book, the ancient book, from about 3,000 years ago, Confucius picked up on it 2,500 years ago and put it into the classics. The name of the book is called The Book.
The book.
The book is called, or the Book of Historical Documents. I'm just bringing one line from this book that says, without learning, you are facing a wall. Arriving at affairs, you always trouble. Basically what it means, if we don't learn relevant things from the history, not just learning history and stuff, but something that is relevant, we get to a similar situation and all of a sudden it's like new, surprise, then oftentimes we have a problem. So I was thinking about it the other day. Let's say I just bought a bicycle, which I did recently, and there's a blue rock on the road. So now I'm driving the bicycle, I see blue, something blue, I get close to it, all of a sudden, boom, I hit it and I do a somersault. The next day I'm going there, I said, hey, blue rock, right? So I learned, so I go around it. Even someone else that hit the rock, tell me, hey, listen, there's a blue rock, don't hit it. So then I go, I don't hit it. When you can flip to the next one. When we are start to talk, and the topic of the class here, of course, is medicine, what happened to medicine, but I want to make it very relevant talking about the corona, the COVID epidemic that we just went through 3 years. All kind of things, lockdown, yes mask, no mask, is it science, not science, right? There was all kind of things back and forth. But actually, it's this story of the marmot. Marmot is this nice cute little furry animal in northern China and Mongolia. That in the 1800s was, very much was liked for its fur. And hunters normally used to hunt it and sell the fur to people that has money. But then the prices of the fur became really, really expensive in the late 1800s. And so something that the hunters would never do, they would never hunt a sick animal before. But now the fur became so expensive, so they started hunting the sick animals and keep them, even the dead animals, because it was so expensive because of the money. And so they caught a virus from it that made the very famous pneumonic plague. In northern China, 60,000 people died from it. I'll tell the story of it. It started from this animal there, and this what happened to medicine, why medicine is used the way it's used today, what happened during COVID here, all starts there with this. So I'm starting it, I'll get back to it again and again and again. I want to start my story here of what happened to medicine by bringing just briefly for 1-2 minutes, very, very ancient history. We'll go back 9,000 years in China. Different civilizations that existed are not at the same time. 7,000, 6,000, 4,000, 3,000 BC in different parts of China. At that time, there was no China. That landmass in Asia, different cultures lived in different places at different times, not even at the same time. If we go to the next map, you see the different civilization at different millennia, living here, there. And I just want to show a few slides, if we can go like a few seconds per slide, to show the different civilization many, many thousand years ago. Just we don't have writings from them almost, just a little bit here and there. We don't know what happened, but you can see from the finishing types of the different things, you can go through a few slides, that these different civilizations were very sophisticated. It's not like cavemen with the thing. It's like very sophisticated civilizations that happened there for thousands of years, different places. So there were some writing, but not really much. We don't know what the culture was like. I want to bring this slide just so that we go through it, we get to the end of it soon with the map. Let's start here. This is when we start talking like ancient China. At this time, it's called the Warring State period. And China in Chinese, the name for China is called Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, or the Kingdom of the Center. Where is the name coming from? Here, there were different states, like different people, right? Different nations. And in the middle, where you see the gray part, it was the central kingdom where the king was. All these different states or fiefdoms, their rulers would bring tributes to the central kingdom. The central kingdom or the king was subject to heaven, subject like to God. I mean, there's no God in Chinese, but there is something called Shangdi, like the divine in heaven. And the king would have to do the right thing by the divine. So if he does something that makes really bad mess to the people, then heaven punishes him, like bringing plagues or wars or something. And that's normally what happens throughout Chinese history. Every so often, 100 years, 400 years, a dynasty came and went. At the beginning, the rulers were very righteous, and then it got corrupted. And eventually either they got a plague or a war and they got defeated, and then the new dynasty came. So these were cycles in Chinese history that everybody knows about. But it starts at this time where the king is in the center and the different states are around it bringing tributes to the king. The king is not really the creator of the universe, is subject to heaven. He has to do the right thing. He has advisor, read the stars, they tell him, now the star says you have to do this offering for the spring. He's not like making his own rule until we get to this period. So this is for the last 1,000 years like this. Until we get to the Warring State here, this state had a new school of thoughts that they developed. It's called the legalist school. Legalist means that the people believe that they make the rules. They make the law. Something similar to what we have today. You have a Congress, you have Senate, they make the law. People sit in there, they decide what we're doing and what we're not doing. Right? This was the legalist view. And at about 240 BC, this legalist became very militaristic and very strong, and they conquered all of them. for the first time, they unified China. This is the first time where China is China. And that's also the name why we call it China, starting from the Qin dynasty. The emperor here said, now for the first time, I'm the emperor. If you heard about the Chinese emperor, this is the first one. Before they were kings, there were no emperors. Emperor basically means I'm God. So there's no God above me. I'm the God. And everyone is subjected to me. He was famous for uniting all the walls of the different states into what we call today the Great Wall of China. That's what he was famous for. Many people died in the process. He said, my dynasty will last forever. Unfortunately for him, after 8 years, it all collapsed. All his offspring were eradicated. So his thing was completely disappeared. And then other dynasty came on, and the idea of the now emperor came back, that we're still subject to heaven. So the emperor, this is the whole Confucius idea, telling the emperor, even though you're all powerful, but if you're doing the bad stuff to the people, heaven is going to give you retribution, and that's the end of it. So that's what everyone for 2,000 years know. It doesn't matter how powerful you are. If you get corrupt at the end, that's the end. We can move on. So I just want to mention this. I'll get back to it later. So that's why it's really important to make sure. So now here, there's just a few things. I'll have you one at a time. Okay. I'm jumping 2,000 years forward. This is start to be relevant for the medicine, what happened to medicine, and then we talked about that pandemic, COVID, and I want to talk about Chinese medicine. But I just want to give in this slide a brief history, very short history of the 20th century, where a lot of things happened. With medicine in general and Chinese medicine. So the fall of the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty of China, was 300 years, very, very powerful dynasty at the time, but again got corrupt, and at the end, like all the waves, with the end of it, 1911, it fell. It followed the Opium Wars, 2 wars in 1850s, 1840, 1850s, where the British and the French started to bring opium. The East India Company brought opium in order to do trade in China. They made a lot of Chinese people addicted and stuff like this. A lot of sick people, a lot of corruption in the government. So the first war was that the Chinese fought the British. They said, no more, we don't want the opium, but because they were much weaker than the British, they got defeated. 10 years later, the British did another war and wanted more privileges. That's where they took Hong Kong. That's when they opened ports in Shanghai and Qingdao and other places. So in 1911 was the revolution and the big plague, which I just mentioned before. This is like just the background of what's happening in the 20th century that leads us to speak about medicine. Okay. Then after the Qing dynasty fell, the Republic or the nationalist Chinese came to power in 1928, but in 1928, China was divided into different sections for the warlord era. So it's like the Republic, but actually the generals didn't listen to the central government. They said, I'm the ruler of Beijing, I'm the ruler of Shanghai. It's called, they were fighting between themselves, who will rule the country. So that was the first period of the Republican. And then from 1928, they actually unified the Republic, and until 1949, this is the nationalist government, which we'll talk about in the first phase of medicine. It's the Republican era. 1937, 1945, Second World War, the Japanese invade China, massacre millions of Chinese, conquered half of China, and the Republican retreat to Western China, Sichuan, and the South. The Second World War is over. 1947, 1949, you have civil war between the communists that now are coming from the Northwest, assisted by the Soviets. And you have the Republicans that were there. Republicans, not the same Republicans, you have the nationalists that were backed initially by the Americans. I'll tell the story in a little bit after that. But we had the civil war between them until at the end, the last point, the communists take over in 1949. The communists were like a very small group, but they were very brutal. They came from the north. The reason that they were able to take over is because the Americans were backing the Republic, the nationalists. But after the Second World War, it started to be like Soviet and the United States. There was a big war that was just over. The American troops came back home. Nobody had appetite for wars anymore. And the American abandons the nationalists. Now the Soviets are pushing the communists down into China from the north. but they were very small, and the nationalists were a huge army. So what they did is they went down to a city in the north, the communists, they surrounded it, and they said, until you fall and come to us, we're not letting you out, there's no food coming in. About 200,000-300,000 Chinese died there from starvation, and then they conquered the city, just let everyone starve. And after that, like Chinese, let the other Chinese die. And after that, they just start traveling south and all the cities cave in. Nobody wanted to be surrounded and die like this. They were like brutal. So people knew that just let them have it. And then the communists took over until today that the Chinese balloons are flying over us. This is
It's so weird.
This is 1900, the entrance to the Forbidden City in the center of Beijing. This is where the emperor and all the eunuchs used to live, all the assistants, all the court of the emperor, at least for the last 300-400 years. Before that, it was the center of China and Beijing. But that was in the 1900s, at the end of the Qing dynasty, where everything was kind of crumbling, right? The empire was crumbling down. That's how it looked like. So Sun Yat-sen, who was the founder of the nationalists in the first half of the 20th century, had a vision. He said, the first step will be to unify China through military force. Remember, there were different generals controlling parts. He said, it's like a war until we bring it together. That was until 1930. And then he said in 1930, after we have all of China together, we're going to do political control or thinking education. We start teaching people how you have to submit to the state, that kind of an idea. That was the second phase. And the big plan was that from 1945, after everyone is indoctrinated, then it will be a democracy. With the assistance of the Americans that at the end ran away. This is Chiang Kai-shek, the general that led the country after Sun Yat-sen died. That's the guy who fled with a bunch of other people to Taiwan and made Taiwan. Right? But this is 1945 on the same gate that I showed you before in 1900. It's the same place. Chiang Kai-shek just for a few more years before they took it down. Go to the next slide. So now I want to start to describe the medicine wars. Like, what is it? Most people don't know what the medicine is. There's Chinese medicine, there's modern medicine, that's it. But actually, there's a big story which is important. Why is it important? Because what I want to show here is that Chinese medicine had to go through a lot of things to get to different places, which I will explain. It's not as simple as just like that's the medicine. And the truth is that the modern medicine is going and went through exactly the same thing, except that I'm a Chinese medicine doctor, so that's my business. That's why I'm focusing on that. If there's a modern doctor here, they should start to investigate what's happening with modern medicine, in politics, and power, and money, and things like that. But my business is here, that's why I'm describing Chinese medicine. So the backdrop of the medicine wars meaning between the ancient medicine and the modern medicine that came into China. So what's the backdrop here? Why is there a struggle? Why can't they just coexist? What's the problem? So we had the plague that I mentioned before, I'm bringing again. 1911, 60,000 people died. I'm going to talk more later, but just to mention here, Chinese medicine doctor went into the plague. They said, oh, this is the qi deficiency, that deficiency. What happened to them? They all died. Because the mortality rate of this plague was 99.8%. Everybody gets sick, dies. COVID was like 0.5% mortality. And everybody freaked out how deadly it was. This is like, if you get it, you're dead. Okay, so that's a problem. But when it is a big problem. We thought that COVID was
Beyond our comprehension.
okay. No, but there's more to it. I'll get to it and talk a bit more. But just to mention here, they brought Wu Liande, who was like a Malaysian Chinese who was educated in Cambridge in England in medicine, and then he lived in Beijing. They brought him to tackle it, and he realized that first it's transmitted by breathing. He actually invented the masks that we wore today. You know, I mean, masks were used before in the 1800s, but only for surgeon not to spit on the patient. Nobody ever used masks to protect themselves before. He is the first one to use it. So what we're using today, N95 mask started from him. But he was able to use Western medicine, as primitive as it was then, to actually control and maintain the pandemic, like save the country. So this is part of the backdrop of the medicine, the ancient medicine in the morning. They said, look, modern medicine works. Chinese medicine, they thought they knew, but everybody was dying. You know, scholar would agree with you. Thanks. Chinese medicine is not, but in any case, you have what they call the May 4th movement. Many people went to study in other countries, and there was like a modernization kind of swing that we need to be modern and so forth. After the Qing fall, you have three Western power, like three foreign powers going into China: the Japanese, the American, and the German, in different parts, and they all start to influence modernization. Like the reason that I don't know if I mentioned that before, but in the 1800s until 1911, the fall of the Qing, there were a few wars that the Chinese lost to the British, to the French, and worse, they lost to the Japanese. Because the Japanese, for thousands of years, were like this little brother from the West, from the East. You know, that they had nothing. And the Chinese were always like an empire, and it was like a vassal state that brings tribute to the Chinese. What happened in Japan in 1600s, the Portuguese got there. The Japanese locked down Japan, didn't want to trade with any foreign nation except the Portuguese, and for 200 years, they locked Japan. Nobody could go into Japan until the mid-1800s, except the Portuguese to one port, and the Chinese and Koreans could go to Japan. In 1850, there's a story what they call the Black Ships. 4 American ships arrived in Japan with coal smoke, so not with the sails. For the first time, Japanese saw ships that comes with smoke. They move without sails. And the American told them, they said, you have to open Japan. The Japanese said, no, we're not opening, you have to go away. They said, either you open Japan or we just blast the hell out. Like you're gonna disappear from the water. So then they left their general, then they came back with 8 black ships. And then the Japanese opened to them the ports, and the Americans start to do trade with Japan. And the Japanese very fast start to modernize. They modernized so much so that in 40, 50 years, by 1900, they were much stronger than the Chinese, you know, with weapons and stuff like this. And then they started encroaching into China and conquer northeastern China, things that never happened before. So that humiliation for the Chinese were brutal. Like the little people, they beat them up. So they meant, you know, if you talk to British, fine. But the Japanese, you know, that was like a total humiliation for the Chinese at that time. So, but now after the Qing fell, you have these 3 powers into China, try to grab pieces of China with their culture and things like that, which is important for our story in medicine. Now, the other problem that they had, lack of medicine, there really was not much of modern medicine in China. Very little. At that time, all through to the communists in 1950, there was 1 modern doctor for 800,000 people. Whereas here, it's like 1 doctor per 800 people. So you just cannot supply the medicine, so they had to rely on some ancient medicine, because there's just no doctors. And so what happened when the medicine war started in China was like a fight in the first half of the century between the modern doctors that were trained either in Japan, US, or Germany, versus the national or traditional doctors. Then the traditional doctors, that's the story that I want to tell in the next 10 minutes. If we go forward, I want to do this story instead of just give a dry historical thing because everybody start getting glossed out and everything. I want to bring 3 people so you see faces and tell their stories. So their stories share what happened in these 30, 40 years until the communists, 1911 to 1949. So let's move. I'll introduce these 3 people. The first one is Yu Yunshu. In the early 20th century, he was a Chinese medicine doctor. After the Qing fell, he went to Osaka to Japan and he learned modern medicine, like Western medicine, so to speak, in Japan. He came back to Shanghai. This is after he's coming back to Shanghai. And at this time, he joined the Ministry of Health. Remember, this is like the warlord era. So the area of Shanghai is controlled on its own. Beijing is on its own. It's not really unified yet. But the Shanghai was the center of the universe there, more than Beijing. He was in the Ministry of Health, and he started saying, look, after 1911, so the Qing fell, they start building railroads according to the Germans. They start to change the economy. the language, they start speaking foreign languages, they start opening to the West. Everything was modernized. And the reason, and I'll get to it a little bit more later, but the reason basically is everyone believed that the Qing failed, the Chinese lost all the time because they were weak, they were primitive, they didn't know what they were doing. If you will be like the Western power modern, we will be strong like them. That was like the national sentiment. He said, look, everything is changing except medicine. You still see all these quacks, all these old doctors. Now in Shanghai, you had a group of very educated people that studied Chinese medicine, the classics, they knew how to read and write. But if you look at all over China, 95% of Chinese medicine practitioners didn't know how to read and write. So obviously they didn't read the classics, they don't know how to read. So you had all kind of traditional things going through families or otherwise. Some of it is very superstitious, some of it had some merit, but everything scattered, disorganized, and nobody really learned it in a systematic way if you can't read or write. But in Shanghai, you had a group of scholars. He said, look, this medicine we can't survive like this in China. If you keep this medicine, we will be like the Qing dynasty. The Western power will keep on dominating us. We're always going to be the weak person, the weak country. He was pushing it more and more and more. He was publishing articles in the newspapers until in 1927, he tried to put through a law in the government. It's called the abolition attempt. It was an attempt to abolish Chinese medicine. 1927, 1929. This is when he was in 1954, already in the communist era, and he helped the communists now flip the script that I'll talk about, but he already got to that first. Let's stay here, we'll move to the next slide. This is Yun Tieqiao. He was also from Shanghai. He is one of what we call the purist classical Chinese medicine. He says Chinese medicine, you connect to the stars, connect to God, connect to whatever you want. Chinese medicine has a lot of wisdom for thousands of years. He started to spar with Yu Yunshu in the magazines. So the one guy would say, no, this is bad, because the earlier guy, Yu Yunshu, he was a Chinese medicine doctor. He knew all the things. And so he started writing articles. He said, look, in the history, you have some people says you have 12 meridians. Other people say you have 11 meridians. Some people say you have 350 acupuncture points. Other people say 300. So is it this or that? It cannot be they're both true. You either have 300 or 350. You can't have both. You either have 11 meridians or 12. You can't have both. Right? So he said, if these are right, at least the other ones were lying. You can't have both. It doesn't make sense. That's how he would argue with all the classics, and he knew them by heart. It's not like the modern doctor. You know, there's a lot of modern doctors that says Chinese medicine is a quack, but they actually don't know anything about Chinese medicine. They just say it's a quack. But the guy before, he actually knew Chinese medicine very well, all the classics. So he knew what to say with substance. And when I was reading his stuff, I just want to share with you. I did this, all comes from this book that I published. It took me 6 years to do the research. What happened in the 20th century in China? I got accepted to Harvard as an associate in research, since it's just a scholarly affiliation, so not really a degree. But they allow you to use all the resources. And for 6 years from Connecticut, I would drive to Cambridge, to Boston, back and forth, go to the basement, microfilms, look at all the text. So this picture, this all comes from this book. I thought that when I publish this book, with all the stuff that I found, it's going to change Chinese medicine forever. But turned out this book is really good, like it's a weight. You know? Like you don't want to read that. But in any case, he was the purest, and he had also beautiful things that he said to counter the other guy. They were fighting back and forth. 1927, when the abolition attempt came through, for the first time, almost ever, the Chinese medicine practitioners from all over China tried to unify because they were going to be outlawed. So they tried to unify the more educated, the less educated. They sent kind of delegates to Nanjing, which was the capital at the time before Beijing, you know, in the center of China. And they, you know, there was a very popular movement to not have it abolished because first there was no medicine, like I mentioned before. There's not enough doctors. And people believed in it, and everybody used to practice it, millions and millions of people. So because it was that popular at the end, they didn't abolish it. And because the Japanese war started, they didn't have a second chance at it, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the other guy. And the third guy that I want to mention, put a face to it, is Tan Sejong. He was from southern China, from Canton, from Guangzhou, like where Hong Kong is in the south. After the wars between the first two, he started another trend and he said, look, Western medicine or modern medicine is good stuff. Chinese medicine is good stuff. Let's do both. Like, let's try to merge them. Take some from this, take some from that. And this notion from the 1930s that he was one of the pioneers in it, carried on to the communist era with other modifications. I just want to mention him, and that's what in effect is going on until today. Remember I told you in New Zealand, the first year and a half is Western medicine, the other year and a half is Chinese medicine. Why? It's like started over here. So remember we had Chiang Kai-shek on this wall. 5 years later, they took him down, or 7 years later, the communists took over. Now they put Mao Zedong on the same wall. I want to tell you that one of the times that I was in China in '98 to pay through college, I was actually acting. I was a movie star. I just wanted to mention it to help me pay my bills. I participated. You can't see the bottom. No, good thing that I want to talk about it. I feel that at the bottom it says the TV. It was a TV serial, like TV serial. It's like a soap opera. And
Very good.
it's
Love
called
it.
Live with Dawn. But it's TV show 1998. Now the reason that I bring it here, the plot takes place in the 1940s. Yours truly is General Jackson, who was the American general that leads all the Americans in China. That's me. And this guy who's lying down, he's a spy. At that time, the communists are not in power. The nationalists are in power. The communists are in the northwest, in Yan'an, close to Russia, in a very remote place. They hardly have any food and no medicine. It's a barren land. They send a spy to the southeast where you have a lot of nationalists to spy on them to bring information. This guy went down to the south and he fell in love with this local southern woman. And his heart is like torn between his love to the woman and his love to the motherland, which is like a communist mother, between the Communist Party. This was, I think, for the celebration of 70 years for China, or 60 years, or something for the communist liberation, it's called. But this is the backdrop that we're dealing with here in this history. That was the show, the whole show was about how the American, and I was then leaving. I said, we are leaving, right? The story I told you, the American left in 1945, and that's why the communists took over China. So that was that. So the communist revolution. So I talked first a little bit what happened to the medicine struggles, the first half of the century between the old medicine and the new, why they kept it. It was not supposed to stay there. It was supposed to get modernized, but not enough doctors. A lot of people liked it. And there was a struggle there between the old and the new. And at the end, the nationalists decided that they could use Chinese medicine, which is at the time was called Guoyi, the national medicine, the medicine of the nation. Modern medicine is medicine, I don't know, medicine of the nation was that old medicine to start to do what we call the nationalism. Get the people to be more excited about the country, something like that. Communist Revolution, 1950s, they preferred modern medicine over Chinese medicine. The elite of the Communist Party almost never used traditional medicine. It's all modern medicine. But when you say modern medicine, again, it's in contrast, not the American modern medicine, it's the Soviet, and there was other theories developing there, mainly from the great Pavlov, the central nervous system and the nerves. That's why acupuncture developed with the meridians according to the nerve and stuff like this. There was a reason how it developed. The same thing, they didn't have modern doctors enough, just in the big cities a little bit. All of China, no doctors, no herbs. The land was barren after the Second World War. You couldn't get herbs, definitely can't get drugs, like modern drugs. At that time, they said, okay, you know what are we going to do? Let's bring all the secrets, all the traditional doctors, Qigong practitioners, there were all kinds of conferences, bring all the secret out so we know what everyone knows in traditional medicine. But at the end, we want to change the ideology. And I bring just a couple of texts. This book has, I went through many thousands of texts and books from that period, but I just within a few hundreds of them, translated them into this book. I'm going to bring 2 texts just that we get the flavor, and I will explain a few things about it. But they changed it ideologically according to Marxism. At that time, it wasn't anymore all doctor versus the new. It became Western doctors against the Chinese. Western are the British and American, who are the evil. And we have our Chinese doctor, which goes also with the Soviets. FYI, I discovered that much of the curriculum in the 1950s of Chinese medicine that was designed, filtered from the old text, was actually done by Soviets, it was not Chinese. So much of the Chinese medicine taught today in school, some of it was decided by Soviet delegation that helped the Chinese, because at the time the Chinese couldn't do anything. But the Soviets were helping them do everything, the economy, industry, medicine, etc. So, and again, they used the same thing, used traditional medicine to do nationalism, like to bring everyone excited about, but this time it was different. It wasn't like the nationalists, it was more Marxism, communism kind of ideology. Here I'm bringing this picture, everyone is holding Mao's red book. Mao wrote different texts, one of them is called On Conflicts, that society constantly has conflicts, and it comes from Marxism. I'll explain it in a minute. But what's important here to see that when you look at the communism, first of all, everyone is happy all the time. But all the masses of the people, you see their faces are disappearing. So you see a few faces of the leaders, but everyone else is disappearing, which means the happiness of the nation is paramount. The happiness of the individual, if you're happy, good. If not, you should sacrifice yourself so the nation will be happy. That's the general idea. I'll explain it. If we go to the next one. So I just want to read just a little, it's not really a whole text, just snippets. So we'll see actually what was said at that time, if it's okay with you, I'll translate it. So this was one very popular in 1955, circulating 50,000 copies, which means all the big cities, all the universities, everybody was reading. And when in communist China, when it comes from the government, that means you have to do it. It's not optional. Like, I don't like this book, right? It's like one voice. Everybody talks in the same voice. In the 1950s, at the beginning, when the communists started, they said, yeah, we want all the opinion now. So people say, yeah, I don't think it's like this. I think we should be free and this. Everyone that talked, they threw them in the gulag. After that, there was no more voices. So at the beginning, they did voices, like different opinions. At the end, communism is all about having one voice, not many opinions. Okay. So here it says, I'll just read with you a few slides, if it's okay, before you fall asleep. In order to advance Chinese medicine research, we must master dialectic materialism thinking weapon. Let me just explain to you, if you don't know what material dialectics are. This is the core of Marxism, Karl Marx and Engels. They were like economists talking about why there's capitalism. So they weren't like this from Germany like 100 years earlier. But the dialectic materialism basically says that the world is material. And it stands in contrast to what we call idealism. Idealism is like when you think about religion, God. Let's say we say we're all connected. This is idealism. Because practically we're not connected. Materialism or dialectic materialism says everything is material. Any thoughts that you have is just imagination. Anything that you believe in is not relevant. What only matters is the truth, and the truth is physical. Now, what happens in the physical world, there's always different kinds of physical items that struggle. They don't agree. And because they don't agree, there's constant change. This one is stronger, this one is weaker, so this becomes that, and vice versa. So this is the idea. It's like materials that constantly shift. Any ideology, any thinking, any imagination, any kind of stuff that you think that is not physical is useless according to that theory. So that's what, when we talk about, we research according to dialectic materialism, that's what it means. Chinese medicine development is closely knit with Chinese social development. The development of the Chinese society was stuck in the feudalism era, which means the hundreds and hundreds of years before. metaphysical thought that was prevalent in feudal society ruled the land. These type theories belong to spiritualism and cannot reflect the objective reality of materialism, the way I explained it before. From practical point of view, the philosophy and spiritualism cannot master the intrinsic qualities of phenomena, of the action of things. We must discard of this spirituality aspect. At the same time, we must avoid the influences of the bourgeois mechanical materialism. In other words, the West also has a lot of material stuff. Modern medicine in the West also was very material. They said, no. Even though it's kind of materialistic, but it's not our kind of materialism. So even the American kind of modernity, they didn't. If we want to advance the research of Chinese medicine, we must oppose pulling backward of the wagon. Like we can't go back to the old ways. We must keep the high and noble way of reaching far within reality, or physical reality. Only if we study it well and effectively master it, that the scientific society will have the characteristics of Marxism and Leninism. It will be the military thinking weapon of the dialectic materialism. This is one text that got the flavor. I'll give you another spiel here, another text, if you don't mind, just a couple of slides starting here. Chinese medicine scientification must start by altering the thinking process, using Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thinking to militarize our own thinking, using dialectical materialism point of view, which I explained before, to research, criticize, and analyze the quintessence of our nation's medicine, the traditional medicine. What needs to be developed should be developed. What needs to be preserved should be preserved. What needs to be deleted and revised should be deleted and revised. Only the quintessence should be left, all the dredges removed. We stand firm, and this is something you're going to love. We stand firm with the Chinese nation. We will develop and fix the traditional knowledge handed down to us from prior generations in order to benefit the workers, farmers, soldiers, and masses. We will resist the imperialists, feudalists, capitalists, merchants, and other business owners. I don't know if you have a business or not, and all others who are bad for the people. And just pausing here for a second, the other things that Marxism has that China picked up is called materialistic history, or history. I don't know how it is in English, but materialism history it's called. And it basically believed that humanity as a society started from a primitive state, like the hunter-gatherer, people hunting stuff. And then it became a feudal society where you have rulers over people, and the rulers start to trade with each other to become wealthy. And in order to trade, they have to use merchants. And the merchants over time gain power because they're doing a lot of business, and they started asking for political capital. And then the feudal society is changing therefore to capitalism. But the capitalist society, in order to thrive, you need to have workers. So you have a boss with a factory that needs to have a lot of workers, or someone that owns the farms and a lot of farmers. And then gradually you have a lot of workers and farmers and stuff like this, and they start to gain power, and capitalism falls, communism shows. And everyone is equal, all the workers, they rule themselves. You don't have people with money ruling them. So that's like I mean, again, if you believe in it, it's fine. If you don't believe it, it's fine. But, I'm just sidetracking for a second. A couple of nights ago, I was in a dinner, some business dinner, and we started talking about this lecture. I'm giving this lecture tomorrow to another group. So I was talking to someone that's going to go to that lecture. And I got to that point. And I said, look, Marxism, communism, I'm not making any opinions here. And he said, no, make opinion, make your opinion. He's like, no, tell me what you think. But in any case, I mean, socialism, communism has some good sides to it, but in history, many times when they did it, it fell. The Soviet Union fell. Chinese communism doesn't exist. It's capitalism with autocracy now. It's not really communism, etc., etc. But to finish that, all those who prevent proper, scientific research, we will fight them all. So, all right. So let's. This is what happened to Chinese medicine in the second half of the 20th century. It's a huge story, and I'm not going to bore you with it. If you want, get this book, read it if you want. But there was a whole lot, how they make the first school, the Western doctors actually did the first class of Chinese medicine, with 200 Western doctors. They decided the curriculum, it wasn't traditional doctors, and so on and so on. There were many different fields. I don't want to go too much into it, otherwise it's gonna blow the head off. I just want us to understand that medicine in the first half was transformed, manipulated for different reasons, with different objectives. In the second half, it was different objectives again with the communists, but they still used it, they still changed it. The reason that it's important for me is not that we'll be historians. Actually, from what I know, any kind of medicine has two sides to it, including modern medicine. There's the doctor and the patient. The doctor comes, the patient is sick, the doctor wants to help. And then there's like the big picture, the government, political power, money, all kind of stories. And again, I didn't do research about everything. But we can see here that there is a medicine part, there is a big picture part. Now, of course, if you're a patient, you want just the medicine. You don't want this big story. So the reason that I went through it as a doctor, not as a historian, I have an interesting story there too. When I started in Harvard, the first week when I went there to listen to a lecture, there was a scholar, a professor, specializing in Chinese medicine history. And I know it because in that conference, he raised his hand, introduced himself. He said, I'm an expert in Chinese medicine, so blah, blah, blah. At the end of the talk, I went to him, I said, hey, I'm an acupuncturist. And he was like, who are you? What are you doing here? Like, acupuncturists don't belong in history research. History is like people that want to know the facts. Acupuncturists normally want to know acupuncture. Not the same thing. But after I did this research, one of the most famous professors from Taiwan wrote the foreword to my book in Chinese medicine history, and everybody started to know me in those circles too. They said, acupuncturists that do this, like, we never heard that before. But in any case, I don't want to go too much into it. I want to start talking about the pandemic, the COVID, the medicine, big pictures, a big picture. And at the end, I'm going to talk about the medicine that I'm doing just a little bit. We don't have much time, but I'll get into what is medicine with God. No one started medicine, no God. But here, I want to tell the story of the pandemics 100 years ago in Manchuria, northeastern China, and related to the pandemic we just had recently in COVID. The title is Sick Man of the East. We can go to the next slide. So, first, I want to talk just a moment about the concept of sick man. So, the British Empire used to call, in the 18th, 17th century, they used to call the Turks, the Turkish people, the sick man. And the sick man there meant, because it used to be the Ottoman Empire, it was like almighty, the Turkish Empire, and it all crumbled. And they said because corruption started to go into the upper echelons of the bureaucracy, that the empire fell. So when they talk about the sick man, it actually doesn't talk physically sick. It talks about the corruption and the fall of empires because of the corruptions in the government. In China, the same way, the British started to call China the sick man of the East. He talked about the Qing dynasty being corrupt, and that's why they were so weak, and the British defeated them again and again and took from them Hong Kong and all kind of other concessions because they were weak politically as people. What happened with this guy, Liang Qichao, and many like him, he was one of the famous philosophers in the 19th century, and later in 1920s, he was one of the ministers, the minister of law in the Republic. He said he started to come up with the idea that he says, actually, it's not just that the people are corrupt, because at that time you have all the opiums and everybody's addicted to opium in China. He said when the people are sick, that's why the nations start to get sick. He is the first one, and people like him at this generation started to make the relationship that when the people are sick, the nations. And that set the stage, just like Darwin and the survival of the fittest. If you're weak, you're going to be extinct. The stronger survives. That's what Darwin said. So when the pandemic broke in northeastern China and people started dying 100% mortality rate, they brought the same guy, Wu Liande, and they created for the first time the public health office And the idea was at that time, because the Japanese were encroaching in, the Russian were encroaching, they wanted to take territories. They said, if we can defeat this pandemic, we will bring other foreign delegates from Mexico, from the US, they brought foreign delegates, try to deal with the pandemic, they will not conquer us. The Japanese will not take land, the Russian will not. They start to merge the health office with actually defending the territory. It started to be, hey, actually it's related. If the people are sick, the government collapsed. But if the people are healthy and we have health structure, we actually defend the land. That's how it started here. So he started a notion that you have to do purification of the individual. The individual, they were talking about the coolies, you know, the people that carrying the little carts, you know, the coolies. They were the most sick at the time of the pandemic. He said you have to purify them, otherwise the nation will not survive. So that was before 1911. And at the end, the Qing dynasty did fall because of it, even though they won. This is what happened. Remember the little animal that I showed at the beginning? The pandemic started here and it went along the train tracks and developed here. What they did at the end, they blocked the train, they blocked the port, they blocked everything, and they start. When William Dett came in, he said, look, this you have to do lockdown and you have to do isolation, find who's sick and isolate them. Now, because the mortality rate was 100%, almost 100%, they would go house to house with a team of soldiers with rifles. Anyone that looks sick and may be sick, they're not sure, they put him in a cart, the train, which was separated from the other. They opened the door after 10 days. It's either they're all alive or they're all dead. So in other words, they put healthy people, some sick, some healthy, they're all dead. If they're dead, they burn the whole car. Right, so that's called like and they invented the mask, you know, but that's called the final lockdowns, the enforcement. Now the orders at the time was, if anyone tried to run, you shoot them on the spot. So you kill them, there's no question asked. Someone tried to run, even if they're not sick. If they're running, they're probably sick, you kill them. You know? But the fact of the matter is that they were able to contain it. Nobody was able to travel south. They locked the ports, and I'm emphasizing it on purpose because I'm going to go to COVID in a second. They locked the ports. A lot of people died here. Whoever died, they made sure they burned them right away. And even if they weren't sure if you're sick or not, you died with them. And they burned you, which was brutal. But at the end, they said, we won. And they didn't lose territories. They maintained the government at the time in the territory, and only 60,000 people died. Now, we're going 100 years forward to COVID. It starts in Wuhan in November 2019, first cases. Then in December, there was a famous doctor that said, hey, I see COVID. They took him, put him in jail for a while. A few weeks later, he died from COVID. Right? That doctor. But there was here something very interesting that happened, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm just trying to make sense of it. The Blue Rock. Remember the Blue Rock? Blue Rock and the other pandemic. In January 23, they decided at the end that there is a pandemic, and we do a lockdown for 76 days. They put tanks around Wuhan and then Hubei province, many cities. 50 million people are in lockdown. Nobody's allowed to leave the house. Like 76 days, except 2 days, something. And at that time, you know, all the flights in China stopped, except that they worked with the WHO to say, look, we have a pandemic, we need help from other countries. So the international flights, they encouraged them to fly, and until April, they keep on trying to push it. I don't know if you remember it or not. And I'm not taking any political side. But Trump was saying, no, stop the travel, this. And then the other people against Trump says, you're xenophobic, you're this, you're hate mongering. Right? There was that talk for the first 2 months before everyone flipped the script at the beginning. The Chinese were pushing a narrative that all the international travel has to keep going. But they locked all the travel in China. Now, January 23 is 2 days before the Chinese New Year. This month, the month prior to that, there's 2-3 million people moving out of Wuhan to all over China for the Chinese New Year's to go to work. Everybody moves out. So again, I don't know. if the traveler can ask what's the meaning of it, but I have some suspicion I want to share with you. You go to the next slide. In December 28, 2019, just when the pandemic started, before they admitted there is a pandemic, and they throw people in jail, like we don't know, there's no pandemic, and there's all kind of stuff going on there. There's a law passed in China. It's called Public Health and Basic Health Improvement Law. That means social medicine. Well, it's always social medicine, but this law actually means, I'm just quoting, it's like a 100-page law, but it says enthusiastically advocate patriotic actions, mobilize the people in the mission to eliminate threats. In that law, actually, it gives total control to the state over the individual to do what they want, including that lockdown, right? It was a shock. And people say, remember here, I don't know if you remember the beginning. In Wuhan, everybody's locked down and stuff like this, and they did it for 3 years. Shanghai was just locked down for 2 months. And they start doing other thing in China, which is unannounced lockdowns. You know, right now here you have a lockdown, let's say New York, lockdown. Everybody knows what we're doing. But in China, like in a city, they will lock down a neighborhood. And then they go in and they start to find out who is talking against the government, and they filter them out. So by 2022, there's very, very few voices left in China. All the organizers of any kind, they all disappeared. But what happened in November this year, like 2-3 months ago, whatever, January, right? In this November 2022, there was a building in northwestern China in a lockdown, one of these neighborhood lockdowns. And someone set fire and many people died in the building, couldn't live in the lockdown. So what that caused, it caused like spontaneous unrest in China, all kind of college kids starting to do a peaceful protest. They go in Beijing and Shanghai and all the cities in China. It's like, you know, people are dying there with these lockdowns, stuff like this. So I don't want to get everyone depressed and stuff, but if you're interested later, I do have a clip of one college student from 2 months ago. She said, if you see that video, I disappeared. She's talking for 2 minutes. Like they arrested her for what they call troublemaking. And you're gone. Let's go to the next slide. But don't get too sad. It's depressing a little bit, but okay. But at the beginning in 2020, February, China expelled 3 Wall Street journalists to China. And I question why did they do it? Just 2 weeks before, when January 23rd, the lockdown in Wuhan, the Wall Street Journal is coming with an article saying the sick man of the East. The same one from 100 years ago, that was the title of the article. The article says now there's lockdown and pandemic in China. China is going to fall, and the United States will be the only superpower left. And after that, I mean, they expelled them. And these 2 months, when they locked all of China and there's no flight, no transportation, tags blocking the city, only international flights. I don't know why. You know, and that's what I told that guy. I said, look, I'm not making any opinion. He said, no, make an opinion. That was what we were talking about. But it's interesting that by February, end of February, when the lockdown finished, 5,000 people died in China. 200,000 people died in Italy, Spain, and the United States. And in Chinese newspaper, they said the USA is the sick man of the West. So I don't know, that was what they were talking about. Let's move on to something more happy. Remember, I showed that map at the beginning. I said the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, the one that did the Great Wall and stuff, the legalist, said I live forever after 8 years it collapsed. Right? He believed there's no gods. He is like doing the rules. He did some things called the terracotta warrior when he died in Xi'an in Western China, where he's buried. He buried within thousands and thousands of this human-sized warriors, believing that the army will go with him to heaven if he's buried with them together. Here we just have our old President Reagan and his wife Nancy. I went to visit 1984. But the reason that I bring it here is because he thought that if he does something that humanly impossible, putting thousands and thousands of warriors, human size, buried with him, he's going to go with the army. But I don't know really, it's the army wedding, have to have it. What I'm saying is, doesn't matter how grand you look at the material, kind of legalist, you physical, but there's no God. At the end, it's just like a bunch of steps, you know. So I want to talk about medicine with God. What do I mean? What happened before him and what happened 2,000 years after him till the 20th century in Chinese medicine. That's what I want. So the medicine that I developed and filtered and recrafted, much of it is classical, some of it I developed myself. I can't explain all of it right now, it's a whole lecture by itself, but I just want to give one point. When I said this is not so good, that's not so good, it's like, what's good? I want to explain one. This medicine that I developed is called Hunyuan medicine or circle medicine. That's the image, which is very simple. Basically explain the following. When a human being is alive, like me, I have an ability to reproduce and create children. The same with the woman, man and woman, with the sperm and the egg. But the thing is, a man has to be alive in order for the sperm to be alive, in order for the baby to be alive. The woman has to be alive in order for the egg to be alive, for the baby to be alive. You cannot have someone of them dead and have a life. From ancient time until today, not thinking of dialectic materialism, thinking the idealism, this other thinking, other type of thinking. They say that life is actually never created. Life is constant. It has to go from one generation to the other, but it's not created. Created actually happened in the 1950s only one time. In the Soviet Union, there was one of their main scientists who was a protege of Stalin. She said, I created life from something that is dead. So what she did, she took like a living entity and she let it die and she filmed it. And then she showed that movie in reverse. Now, because she was the protege of Stalin, all the scientists in the Soviet Union put their seal of approval on it. Everybody agreed that it's possible from something dead to create life. 5, 6, 7 years later, they found out that it was scam. She disappeared. Nobody ever talked about it anymore, and you don't know what happened. The reason that I know it is while I was researching the Chinese medicine part, in 1952, there were people talking about it. You see, the Soviets are so great, they created life from dead objects. The American could never do it, but you know, it was born. So then they stopped talking about it because they realized this. But other than that one story, life is constant. It is passing from one person to the other, but it's constant. This is something that the ancients called heaven and men unite. Meaning the heaven energy that is in people is constant. It's not what we think. I mean, the human being is limited, 100 years. But if you're talking about the life going, it's something that continues from life. It's not dead and life again, dead and life again. So in Hunyuan medicine, I started to incorporate this understanding. This circle, how to analyze it, has many, many stories behind it, a lot of understanding. Inside, how the heart is related, the emotions, generosity, kindness, all these qualities that make us human. Where are they coming from? They're coming from this one line called life. It's not coming from the body, it's not coming from the external desires or things that are acquired with life, but rather constant. You know, so in the process, like I was researching another school, it's called the Huaishan school, started by this guy, Liu Yuan, 300 years ago. These are one of the things that got eradicated by communism. He and his school had thousands and thousands of students from all over China going to He was developing all this heart medicine, the inner circle, and a lot of stuff going on there. How the heart and the emotion and the spiritual side of the person is related to the health of the person. You know, so just think about if you are unhappy, anxious, angry, and you get sick, how long it is to recover versus if you're happy and calm and you're on the beach and so blessed. The body naturally will start to heal much, much faster. And the implications here are far and wide. So for example, what's the importance when someone getting to the end of life that his family will be with him? What happens there? when we talk about the COVID lockdown, people dying alone without their family. Said, okay, you don't want the virus, just like in 1911, put them in a cart and you burn them all together. What's the implication there? It's very, very big, not the scope of this lecture, but I'm just pointing out that when you talk about medicine with God, you start talking there. Like all kind of things, all kind of levels that maybe we're missing, and I was trying to introduce with it. Let's move. I also have a startup. I just want to mention, if you want to check it out, Zerai.com. Zerai, actually, Zaire is a Kabbalistic term, AI, artificial intelligence. It's called Zerai. This is a startup that I'm putting together with a bunch of other tech people out there about cancer patients, for the emotional crisis that is created when you get a diagnosis and treatment. If you go to that page, we'll get to have some bot there. You can play with the bot and videos that we're just starting. You can check it out. So, final word in this lecture. Thank you so much for keeping so attentive, or maybe you fell asleep, I don't know. But final word, what happened to Dr. Brown? Dr. Brown is actually a nurse. So when our kids were babies, we went to pediatrician group. One of them was Dr. Brown. He was old, he was about to retire in the 1950s. And I remember having a conversation with him. He was very kind and very nice. I said, look, we don't want this. We don't believe in that, whatever it may be. And he said, look, I'm not the medicine police. In my time, if you want to do it, you can do it. Don't want to do it, not do it. We talk in a way that was very, very uncommon. Very quickly later, he retired. And after that, I've never seen a doctor. They all like, you have to. What happened in COVID? You know, and again, I'm not taking any side, but it was like a lot of shaming for both sides. Look at these stupid people wearing masks. Look at these stupid people not wearing masks. You know, everyone will start to be very antagonistic to each other. Again, I'm just pointing this, so we think about what happened to these doctors. They used to come to your house and know all your family, and we're sitting there for a couple of hours. What happens today? You come and you rush 2 minutes and you wait for 5 hours. Like what happened to this? So thank you very much. If you want to see some of my books, gumroad.com/your own sideman, my clinic, .org, courses. Oh, other question. You have any questions? Go ahead.
What was this May 4th thing? You said May 4th, and there was, you skipped over it, but it was a May 4th revolution, and then it.
May 4th, the beginning of the 20th century, was a movement of like educated people from the big cities like Shanghai, Beijing, and this, that were very educated in what happens in the West, in England, in the US. They brought all this new philosophy of modernization, world literature, all kinds of things. It's not in China for the May 4th movement, like the new intelligence.
And what was the significance of that date?
Wasn't
Well,
a
I
date,
think, yeah,
wasn't a date, it was.
no, it was May 4th. Something started on May 4th that triggered this whole movement. If you Google it, May 4th, you see like a long story, people involved, what happened. But for our purpose, it just showed that there was modernization.
So I have a question. So basically, what we think of as Chinese medicine for so many is really like a combination of Russian Western medicine mixed with some stuff that they handpicked.
Well, what I try to show is that the medicine is always picked. Actually, if you go into deeper history, further back in history, it was also like this. Song Dynasty 1,000 years ago, they also kind of shifted through it depending on what happened. I just think the reason that I brought it is not to say good or bad. Sometimes there are new things created and they're better. Doesn't have to be that the other thing is better. But it's important to know that there's all kind of hands in this pudding. And if you are a patient, first being aware of it is good. And second, the method that I recommend. Like, how do I know? I go to a doctor, any doctor, Chinese doctor, modern doctor, whatever it is. How do you know that you want to be there? My opinion is, if you feel like you're overwhelmed with love, it's good. someone that, because normally they will research well, they feel very responsible. If you feel like they kind of move you along, it's a business, that doctor probably didn't put their heart in it, it's for the business. So just go to another one. Again, I'm not saying Chinese or Western or whatever it is, but that's my recommendation. But I think it's important to know. Don't just believe everything. I remember seeing a personal trainer, I don't know what's his name, died when he was 90 or 100. People asked him, what's your secret? He said, well, never go to the doctor. Exercise, eat healthy, don't go to the doctor. So, and that worked for him.
That's what I was just.
From New York.
Question, so with the Hunyan circle medicine that you've created, what percentage is influenced by the ancient, origins of the Chinese medicine, and what percentage is influenced by Western medicine for you? And what you do?
I would say it's 70% the ancient, 20% me, and 10% mine.
Right.
Kind of a mixture.
Yeah.
But I would also say that it was for me like very process of humility, because over the 30 years, I always thought that I knew really, really well. And then after researching it for a few years, I thought, crap, actually I didn't know much. It's kind of like if you don't have this humility, you can't go to the next level. You always think that you know the best and you always take the first step. So you have to realize, wow, there's actually so much more to it. It wasn't that good. So then people ask me, so wait, so if you treated someone 20 years ago, it wasn't that good, which is true. However, I think when someone comes to see you, the practitioner, they only want from you one, that you do your best. So 10 years ago, that was my best. Now it's my best. Come, if you can wait another 20 years, come then. But the truth is, if you go to a practitioner and they're constantly doing their best is not the best to make business, the best to research, to get deeper and deeper and deeper, then you got your money. That's all.
Very good. And that brings us back full circle to the first quote you had with the, without learning, you were facing a wall.
Yeah. Always in the dark.
So your teacher who's no longer alive, how much of your teacher is in Hunyan medicine?
Well,
Because that was a no whole other topic.
Well, I used to study internal arts, Tai Chi, Qigong, and things like that from a teacher who was very famous, who created the Hunyuan system, Hunyuan Tai Chi, Hunyuan Qigong, that's why I took the name. But he wasn't doing medicine, but he was doing that Hunyuan that was circled, everything was circular, connected to heaven, that kind of thing. And that was really appealing to me, the name and some of the logic there. Other teacher I had for classical Chinese medicine, for this Huaishuan, heart methods. And at one point it all converged to me, it all made sense, But it was a process of investigation. I'm now teaching a course in Switzerland, which is 2 months, once a week on Zoom with a group. I used to go around the world to teach seminar in COVID. I took a break. My wife is really happy that I'm not traveling, but they asked me if I want to go back to Switzerland. I said, yeah. But it's like, it takes at least 2 months to go through the circle. There's a lot of things, teach, logic, but I think what's beautiful about this circle medicine is that it's very clear, very logical, but it goes deeper and deeper. And it doesn't matter how deep it goes, still makes sense. So it never becomes so philosophical that you say, oh, wow. But I'm not sure. It always makes sense, but goes deeper, 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 and that's really good.
So for all of us here who are here on yoga retreat or yoga school, the big takeaway is that we get to continue introspecting and realize how much political stuff is involved with everything that we think is straightforward medicine, that there's a lot.
Well, there are 2 ways to look at it.
Yeah.
One, someone told me that once, and I didn't agree. Someone told me ignorance is bliss. You don't know, you're not worried. But that's a mistake because there's a lot of blue rocks.
There's a
You
lot,
keep on doing somersaults.
true.
So I think it's better to be worried, proactive. But at the end, the more you know, the more you get peace. Like, hey, like when the pandemic started, COVID and this lockdown, and people were like, hey, I'm gonna die. And I'm like, hey, Blue Rock, we've been that already. I mean, it could be dangerous. I'm not saying it's not dangerous. But I saw all the other things, all the politics and all this, I could see through it. You know, you had that in the past, you've seen it already. So that's why it's important to know, it actually brings you peace, not anxiety. Anxiety comes when you don't. But all of a
Yes,
sudden, what happened? What happened? It happens already.
Yeah.
So if you know, it's
And
well,
everybody can get all of like your qigong and tai chi and these other lectures, and things that you're doing right from your website, right?
you can find it on the website. There's a lot of YouTubes. If you Google my name, hundreds of free clips that you can watch.
for Qigong and Tai Chi.
Qigong, Tai Chi, there's many free videos. The school that I have, they have many big courses. You go each course 20 hours, deep. But if you don't want to invest the time and effort, you can do some free videos. Also, my books, you can buy them hard copy, but if you get ebooks on the link, it's much cheaper to get a PDF and read it.
I was looking for a new paperweight,
It's very- Yeah, so.
Thank
well, thank you so much.
you so much.
What a cup of tea.